We're still in this book, Handy Guide to Preaching, put out by the Spiritual Sword back in July. And the chapter that we're looking at tonight is the preacher and the eldership, starting on page 37. Now, why are we talking about this?
Because we want an eldership.
We want an eldership, absolutely. Why else?
In case we ever go somewhere with an eldership.
Okay?
Because most of the, if you want to call them requirements for preacher, elder apply to Christians, except maybe
Right.
some of the marital stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So most of those we should all be astride.
You're right. You're right. All of us should be striving to meet the qualifications of the eldership, other than the marital, the family situations. Now, certainly, if you are married, you should strive to meet those qualifications. But for those who are not married, that's fine. That's your decision. And that's a personal decision. Some people don't want to be married, and that is perfectly all right. Now, the lesson, the article here focuses a lot on the preacher and his relationship to the eldership. And one of the things he writes here in the second column under that heading, it's such an obvious proposition. The preacher must develop a good personal relationship with his elders. While that is true, I don't want to limit it to just the elders. I think the preacher, whoever it may be, should develop a good personal relationship with the church in as much as he can. Now, some people may be difficult, and sometimes preachers have difficulty doing that. But we should all strive, both the preacher and the church should strive to work together to have that relationship. Since that is true, why does there seem to be so many problems between preachers and elderships in the brotherhood at large? What Brother Jackson says here is there are many reasons, of course. Some preachers are good, some should have quit yesterday. Similarly, some elderships excel while others resemble the biblical ideal in name only. That being said, many problems between preachers and elders can be avoided. Brother Jackson makes 2 points. And keeping in mind that this is written generally to preachers, but it's good for the church at large to know this. Number one, he says you cannot be a good preacher with a bad eldership. Because ultimately, a bad eldership will not let you be a good preacher. What is a good preacher?
One that preaches the truth.
All right, Earl?
I said one that preaches the truth.
One that preaches the truth. That's right. There's
Steward of the word.
a good steward of the word. It's important to understand. Paul said in 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word. Jesus said in John 17:17 that the word is truth. And those who stand in the pulpit have that responsibility to be good stewards. And we'll talk about that as we progress through this a little bit tonight. The second thing that Brother Jackson says is you cannot be an effective preacher, no matter how polished you may be in the pulpit, if your relationship with an otherwise good eldership hangs by a thread. Every flaw will be magnified, and your positive contributions will evaporate like the morning dew. If you are serious about being an effective, influential thought leader for Christ in the local congregation, as a good and faithful minister, then it is imperative that you learn how to cultivate a peaceful, blood brother bond with your elders. Why is he saying this to preachers? Note the verse that he references, Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as much as lies within you, be at peace with all men. We each individually have the responsibility to not cause strife. So it's my responsibility, in as much as lies within me, to be at peace with Earl.
Well, you sort of touched on what I was going to say.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're just a member or a member, not just a judge. If you're an elder, if you're the minister, if you're the wife of an elder, or someone that is not even a Christian yet. Each and every person that comes to the Lord's house needs to come for one purpose.
Right.
To do and serve the Lord to the best of their ability in any capacity that they can.
Amen. We each have an individual responsibility, no matter what our primary function may be. We have to make sure that we are doing everything we can to fulfill what God's will is. So let's look at a few things here that Brother Jackson relates to us. Number one, he wants to make sure that we understand what the real job is. It's not to be academic, although preachers should be students of the Word. That's not the primary function of their job, is it? What is the primary function? It's to influence souls through preaching. Now, while studying is not the primary function, it's impossible to do this without studying. So we need to make sure that the preacher is doing his job. That he's doing what he can to influence the folks who do gather together for the good, for the cause of Christ.
Be a good example.
Be a good example. Let no one despise your youth. That's what he says in 1 Timothy 4:12. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example to the believers, of the believers, for the believers, whatever version you may have. And then he lists, is it 6 different things there? Love and purity and peace, and I can't remember what they all are off the top of my head. But we need to be an example. Whatever a Christian should be, the preacher.
Purity and spirit.
Faith and purity and spirit.
And love.
And love.
Conduct, too.
Conduct, absolutely. The way that we behave should be the way every Christian behaves. We talked about examples on Sunday morning and how we need to look to proper examples and we need to be proper examples because there is somebody who is looking at us, whether we want them to or not. Charles Barkley, NBA player, many, many years ago, had an advertisement come out, I believe it was with Nike. And the thrust of that advertisement was, I am not a role model. Sorry, Sir Charles, but you are. You were then and you still are today because he's still a broadcaster for the NBA. When we are in front of anybody, whether it's standing in the pulpit or mowing our grass, driving on the road, we are being an example. We need to act like Christians wherever we find ourselves. Number 2, Brother Jackson says that we need to develop the right mindset. Now again, this applies to every Christian, and it applies to your relationship with every other Christian, whether in eldership or the person sitting in the pew in front of you. It applies to preachers, It applies to elders. It applies to deacons. It applies to members. Everybody needs to develop the right mindset. How do we develop a good relationship with our elders or with our other members? We start by accepting this fact. The bulk of the burden in this relationship is yours. Be at peace as much as lies within you. It is your responsibility to make it as good of a relationship as you can. Now, Brother Jackson does apply this specifically to preachers for a moment. He says, not fair? Maybe. But doubt me at your own peril. You are one, they are many. They consist of multiple personalities. You have the one that you have. They decide to hire you, and they can park the U-Haul in front of your house at any time. And bless their human hearts, they are under relentless pressure from the terrors who are constantly clamoring for the focus of their attention. It is up to you to develop the right mindset for preaching. And that involves accepting the responsibility for your relationship with your eldership and the congregation. Once you accept this obligation, the next step is to open the eyes a little wider to see the reality of the landscape. And reality is something that sometimes we have trouble accepting. And that's why he goes into this next point of having realistic expectations. These verses, the first two passages at least, deal with the qualifications of elders. Have you ever served in a church where there was at least one elder who did not meet some of these qualifications? Who probably should not have been appointed to the eldership to begin with? I have. I've been in situations where some of the men, not as a preacher, but as a member, where some of the men did not have a proper attitude. But they were elders. They did not conduct themselves the way they should have, but they were elders. They allowed things to go on within the church that should not have been going on, and yet they were elders. Turn over to Titus chapter 1. Let's look at these real quickly. Titus chapter 1. Beginning in verse 5. And we're going to go through the end of the chapter. It says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city, as I commanded you. If a man be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. For a bishop must be blameless, as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those that contradict. Why?" Titus goes on. "For there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain." We'll go ahead and stop there because of time. But we have seen this time and time again in the brotherhood at large. There are too many men who are in pulpits who should have had their mouths stopped. We think about men like Max Lucado, Rubel Shelley, and others of that nature, whose elders should have stepped up and said, "You're not preaching the gospel. You need to sit down and shut up." That may be harsh. But when we come to what God has revealed, we need to stand firm. We need to be sure that we are teaching the right thing. We need to be sure that we are receiving the right thing. And when there are elders, they need to be sure that what is being taught is according to the Scriptures. Why do more elderships allow false teaching to occur? Hebrews 5:12. They are not mature. They are still babes in Christ themselves. They may have been Christians for 50, 60, 70 years, but they're still novices at the Word. They should have been teachers by this time themselves. And if they're not teachers, they shouldn't be elders. Okay? So we need to be sure that when the time comes to look at men for the position of an elder, that we need to be sure that they match, that they meet the qualifications more than just being married and having faithful children. Those are important, but we need to look at the attitudes of the men. We need to look at the behavior of the men. How do they conduct themselves as members of the church? Because if they're not going to conduct themselves appropriately as members, how can we appoint them to elderships? Are we in agreement on that? Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. Don't be desperate for a preaching job, because this is directed at preachers. And I disagree a little bit with Brother Jackson on this. He tells us that, you need to develop a marketable skill so that you're not put into a position where you are desperate for a paycheck. And I understand what he's saying. I really do. But the issue comes in, if I have a backup plan, will I ever go through with what God has blessed me with? Will I ever go through with this passion to preach? Jeremiah talks about the need to preach. Paul talks about the need to preach. Now, Paul had a tent maker's attitude, right? He was able to support himself. And I get what Brother Jackson is saying, but I think that there is a danger in it as well. When I began to look at getting back into ministry a few years ago, it was hard to leave my job. Even though I knew that I needed to for multiple reasons, it was hard to do that because it was safe. Well, safe is not always right. Let me take that back, because it may not be right or wrong. Safe is not always the best way to go when we're talking about preaching. We need to be driven, like Jeremiah and like Paul, to spread the gospel, to spread the truth as far as we can. But I do agree with Brother Jackson. We need to not be so desperate. Let's look at it from the preacher standpoint first. Not so desperate that we take any job with a bad eldership. From the congregation's standpoint, we not be so desperate that we appoint any man to be an elder. We need to not be so desperate that we hire any man to be the preacher. It's a serious job. It's a serious consideration. And it's not one to be taken lightly. All right. When the preacher tries out with a new congregation, and I loathe that term when it comes to preaching, but for lack of a better way to express it, that man needs to appraise the eldership. he should be interviewing them as much as they are interviewing him for this very reason. And he needs to interview the congregation. Don't just focus on the elders. Talk to the men and the ladies and the children, the teenagers. Find out where people are spiritually. Find out where they are in terms of evangelism, in terms of benevolence, in terms of edification. Find out whether or not you agree with their mindset, because every congregation has a different personality. We've got several congregations right here in the area. We've got several different personalities right here in the area. When we get down to Lexington, they're different than Grant County. When we get up to Boone County and Campbell County, they're different than Grant County. Doesn't mean that they're right and we're wrong, or that we're right and they're wrong. We're just different. And each congregation, as an autonomous congregation, has the right to have different opinions about how certain things are handled, so long as we don't violate what the Word says. Does that make sense? All right, so we need to make sure that we appraise the eldership and the congregation. We need to make sure that the preacher is doing his job in the pulpit. The preacher is a reflection on the eldership that hires him. 1 Timothy 4:16 talks about the importance of preparation. Paul says, "Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you." We must be prepared to answer questions when we are spreading the gospel. And if we're not living appropriately, the answers that we give won't be taken seriously. So take heed to yourself, make sure you're living right, and to the doctrine, to make sure that you are sharing the truth. Focus on local work. Matthew 6:24, you cannot serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one, serve the other, and love the other. There's some preachers who are so focused on being published, on speaking on lectureships, and their focus is outside the local church, outside the local community. Does that mean that speaking on lectureships is wrong? No, but it should not be their driving force in what they do. What we do here should be the most important thing to each and every one of us. Every single preacher, every single member should be focused on the work in Grant County to see that the church grows. All right, and the final thing here, intentionally develop intimate relationships with the elders. And I'd like to expand that to the membership at large. It's hard to do sometimes. And especially the larger the congregation gets, the harder it is to have those relationships. But we need to try as much as we can to have a good relationship, a friendship, if you will, with everybody in the congregation. Any questions or comments? Earl.
I was going to talk about when a man is looking for a job, even in our world today, you need, in his interview, you need to find out from the job that he came from, as to why he met and whether any problems, and you do a lot of your research of what a man that already is somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's it, and that he comes forth because he is a fit for your congregation.
Right.
Well, when I say a fit, does he match up good?
Yeah.
And as you know here, and I commented on to you many times, I just wish we had enough people to have the eldership, or even back when George and I was more able to do things. At least the preacher here, we still have to include the preacher, we just couldn't even have an eldership. But the got that, but yet it made for a close-knit eldership and preacher relationship.
Yeah.
But not only that, it's your congregation, remember. With the exception maybe of one or two things that's happened here, we've always had a close-knit
Mm-hmm.
membership and let's say preacher, relationship.
Yeah.
And of course, when we didn't, the only problem we had with the eldership is after I resigned and one came in behind me, there was a disagreement and the elders handled it properly and that's the way it should be.
Right, right. And to go along with that, not only should the elders or the congregation find out how the preacher has conducted himself at his present and former congregations, the preacher should ask the eldership how they have handled disagreements within the congregation and how they've handled issues that pop up in the brotherhood. Because every church has to handle those things at some point. And we need to be forthcoming about it. We need to be honest about it. How did, that's a good example of the disagreement that was within the eldership, and it was handled properly. And so we need to make sure that we do look at those things as well. All right, next week, what about women preachers? Read pages 41 through 44. This will be the last one out of this book. And then we'll have 2 more weeks of something about preaching. Haven't decided yet before we get into the next booklet. All right, so read this and be ready to discuss. Thank you for your attention.